What's up, everybody? Welcome to your weekly installment of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast. It is I, your host, and the Nuclear Barbarian, Emmett Penny, and I'm here with, I think, my favorite energy writer, easily top three, Robert
That's
Bryce, the host of the Power Hungry podcast, author of, what is it, 8 books?
six.
Six. Okay. And you wrote and I think directed The Juice, correct?
The executive producer. My colleague Tyson Culver
Okay.
directed it and did a great job.
Yeah, and you did a great job in it. And of course, your most recent book is A Question of Power, which I love. I read it at the end of last year, very much enjoyed it. So everybody should go check out Robert's stuff, buy that book, listen to the podcast. You know the deal. All that'll be in the show notes. But today, Robert is here to join me in our mutual contempt for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and some of their recent behavior. So why don't you set the table for us, Robert? What's been going on?
Well, look, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is right now it has 3 members. There's still 2 open seats. The Biden administration has been in office now for 15 months, and they still haven't appointed 2 of the members for the 5-member commission. So to me, on its face, that indicates that they're just not serious about nuclear. But then you have, back up even before that, who's one of the top climate advisors in the Biden administration? Gina McCarthy. What was her previous job? Natural Resources Defense Council. What is the Natural Resources Defense Council about? Anti-nuclear. They cheered on and pushed for the closure of the Indian Point Energy Center in New York, which, in my view, was without doubt, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the entire state of New York, and particularly for the city of New York, and they've closed it prematurely. Okay, so background, but I could go on that because it still is, even as I say I get irritated again. But what's happened just this in the last 2 months? Well, in early January, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission poured out the application that was put forward by Oklo Power, which is a Silicon Valley-based startup. They had a 1.5 megawatt reactor, fast reactor that they were developing and want to commercialize, and their license was just tossed out by the NRC without warning, without any. They didn't even warn Oklo that they were going to do this. They just poured them out. Now, on a technicality, it appears to me, okay, and there's timing here matters a lot, Emmett, and this happened just a few days after the Chinese began operating a high-temperature helium-cooled gas reactor in Shandong province, producing commercial power from a 200-megawatt gas-cooled reactor. This is cutting-edge nuclear technology for any country in the world. And the Chinese are beginning to produce commercial power, and here the NRC won't even let a startup even proceed in their application process. They just toss them out. And then what happened last week, and this is the part that just flat, as my late brother John Bryce used to say, just grills my cheese, that the NRC again takes an action that is inexplicable, and that 2 years after, in one case, and 3 years after in another, they rescind the license extensions that were given to 2 nuclear plants, the Turkey Point reactor, the Turkey Point plant in Florida, which is owned by Florida Power and Light, a subsidiary of NextEra Energy, and they did the same with Peach Bottom in Pennsylvania, which is owned by Constellation. So this is just, and why did they do it? They got a petition from a fringe anti-nuclear group founded by, of all people, wait for it, Helen Caldecott, who's, I will say, a quack when it comes to the issue of radiation.
Yeah, for people who don't know, Helen Caldecott is an Australian doctor, I believe.
That's right.
Who maybe she was famous before this, but I saw her rise into the public eye even before I was into nuclear in the aftermath of Fukushima. And she peddled some of the most grandiose, apocalyptic, nightmarish claims, totally scientifically unfounded, about the radiation hazards there. But to this day, no one has suffered from radiation poisoning as a result of what happened at Fukushima. No deaths or injuries can be attributed to that at all. And yet, here she is in an NGO that just asks, I guess, very politely for the NRC to rescind this. And they say, yeah, sure, happy to go back on our word and create uncertainty in an already jeopardized industry. I mean, you can't even make it up.
And I think that that's the key issue here, Emmett. It's not only is the timing important, right, that they rescind these license extensions, which were lawfully granted. And then here comes Beyond Nuclear saying, oh, well, you didn't do it was a generic environmental impact statement. Well, okay. But now is this a banana republic or not? I thought, well, one of the things that I take enormous pride in the United States is that we are a nation of laws, and that you have an agreement, you have a legal settlement, and that's the deal, right? Everybody
Yeah.
agrees to play by the rules. And yet in this case, it's like, oh no, we're just joking because now there's a change of administration and suddenly the laws aren't the laws. We're going to
Hmm.
change them because we have now two Democrats and one Republican. And you saw Commissioner Wright, and the Republican dissented, and he called this is arbitrary, and this is an arbitrary, and he didn't use the word capricious, but that's what it is.
Yeah,
But
it's
but
absolutely capricious. I mean, it's impossible to read it as anything else. I mean, the thing about these environmental impact statements is clearing the threshold for them is incredibly high. Their cost benefit analysis doesn't value energy itself,
right,
from what I can tell. Because if it did, and we subjected wind and solar to the same regime, it would never be built in this country
right.
because it just wouldn't clear the threshold for usefulness. So, in the middle of all this, we have auctioned off $4+ billion of federal lands to privateers in New York for offshore wind.
Which
And
which is among the most costly ways of generating. I mean, I think it's only second
hugely
only.
costly, and it takes a lot of land. I mean, that was land that was federally protected by FDR. So
Right.
to me, there's a huge betrayal of a certain democratic legacy happening here.
I like that, but it's also just this idea. Okay, well, in terms of what this idea of levelized cost of electricity, which is a very very fraught and inaccurate way to talk about the price of what electricity is worth. But
Mm-hmm.
offshore wind, it's second only to actually burning American currency in terms of cost. I mean, there is absolutely no more expensive way of producing electrons than offshore wind. And what is happening now? You talk about what's going on. Well, under the Biden administration, they offer a lease right on top of the remaining North Atlantic right whale habitat, on the
Mm-hmm.
just smack on the dot on top of it. And the Sierra Club and all the rest of these activist groups, I'm not calling them environmental groups. All these activist groups are just like crickets. Oh yeah, well, never mind right whales. We love wind turbines more. I wrote that story already. I wrote that article a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
But one more point on this, since I'm on the rage
Yeah, go
here, and
for
I
it, man.
just got the rage button going. But for the NRC to pull back these license extensions, effectively on almost the same day that Russia invaded Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and under an administration that has said climate change is one of their top priorities. I mean, who are these people? I mean, what do they do? I mean, is there any strategy at all in any of their thinking about the energy business? It appears to me there is not any at all. There is no strategic sense of energy as the most important commodity in our economy. There's no
Mm-hmm.
idea of what the lag times, the idea of substitutability and the limited substitutability. I mean, it boggles my mind, and it leaves me frankly enraged because it's so irresponsible, and there is no accountability. And the mainstream media just will not cover it. They just don't. And I find it offensive in the extreme.
I feel like there's a really cruel awakening happening because when I take a look at everything that's happening in the energy world, not just with the NRC nuclear, I mean, they've been a nightmare for a really long time. And part of that is frankly the Atomic Energy Commission's fault and the utility industry's fault. It is hard to outdo the level of condescension, arrogance, and entitlement that organization, the Atomic Energy Commission, and that industry, the investor owned utility industry in America, had in the 50s and 60s over nuclear. Outright lying to the public, embracing linear no threshold because they figured accidents weren't going to happen anyway, so it doesn't matter how you measure it, measure radiation exposure. So there's a lot of like long-term trends that are now coming to a head here. So that aside, when I'm looking at raising food prices because energy prices are going up, all this stuff together, next year is going to be full of turmoil all over the world. And it's going to be really hard on working American families. We're a baseline insanely wealthy country. So I doubt that there's going to be like deposed ruler level
Sure. Right.
issues. but we can look for a much more complicated world unfolding
Absolutely.
in front of us. And that is very worrying because it doesn't feel like there's any coherent hand on the rudder.
No, no coherence whatsoever, Emmett. And one of the things that, I've for now at more than a dozen years, I've been promoting natural gas to nuclear. This is the way forward. If we're serious about
Mm-hmm.
decarbonization, if we're serious about a small footprints, and this is one of my main gripes, and it will remain one of my main gripes against the wind energy business. I'm a bird watcher and have been for 30 years. These turbines kill birds. They also kill bats.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of our wildlife that we own together in common. But
Mm-hmm.
back to the natural gas part of this, the other part of what's clear in the wake of this, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we can talk about whether it makes any sense geopolitically why Putin is doing it, but it's going to have a huge impact on food prices and on
Yep.
fertilizer availability for farmers all over the world. Russia
Mm-hmm.
was a big fertilizer exporter. Ukraine was one of the biggest suppliers of wheat in the world, particularly into the Middle East. So the instability in commodities across the board is enormous. And who is going to pay? Who's going to bear the brunt of this? It's the poor and the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just wrote a piece. I've sent it to the LA Times. I don't know if they'll run it, but you live in California. Look at in last year alone, residential electricity prices in California went up almost 12% in one
Mm-hmm.
year. The all
Mm-hmm.
sector price went up almost 10%. And this is just a soupçon, a appetizer for the massive price increases that are coming because, again, of short sighted, I would say, irresponsible energy policy that says, oh, we're
Mm-hmm.
going to do it all with wind and solar. They're going to have to spend, according to the PUC and CAISO, they're teeing up $80 billion in new spending. That's what they're estimating now. Well, look at the bullet train in California. It's supposed to cost $42 billion. Latest estimate, $105 billion. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's going to be ruinously regressive on the poor and the middle class in California, in a state that brands itself as progressive. And again, you're just getting me all ticked off here,
I know,
Penny.
I know. Well, that's why I brought you on to do this to you because I'm about to poke the bear again by saying your state, Texas, isn't faring much better. I mean, you guys have a ton in the ERCOT pipeline. You
Oh,
wrote a piece about that too.
yeah. Well, first, these apologists, and there were a bunch of them after
Mm-hmm.
the blackouts hit last year, saying, "Oh, don't blame renewables." Oh, those crazy Texas politicians, saying this is the fault of renewables. It's all ahistorical.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in the years before the blackouts? $66 billion spent on wind and solar, according to the wind and solar industry's own numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's ever challenged my numbers on this. And all of that spending was effectively worth nothing at 2
Mm-hmm.
a.m. on February 15th when the grid was on the verge of collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And so now where are we? Well, I wrote another piece about the Texas section of the American Society of Civil Engineers. They released a report last month pointing out that what is weakening the grid in Texas? Well, bad market design, that's clearly part of it, but excessive subsidies for wind and solar. And
Yes.
here's the punchline. Those federal subsidies, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, are leading to a situation where by the end of next year, Texas could have more wind and solar connected to the ERCOT grid than they have natural gas fired capacity. We're recreating the California mistake in Texas.
Yep. Yeah. So just for people who don't totally know, like what's the difference between these two subsidies? We've got the production and the investment subsidies. So how do those work?
So the production tax credit is based on how many watt hours a given facility produces. So for wind, it has been depending on what, the level of subsidy, but it's generally been between 22 cents or $22 and $25 per megawatt hour. And under the Build Back Better Act, the wind lobby was pushing for a $25 a megawatt subsidy for 5 years. Now, thanks to Joe Manchin, yeah, right. Thanks to Joe Manchin, that was killed. The
Mm-hmm.
investment tax credit, it's a certain percentage. I think it's something like 30%. I've forgotten off the top of my head. But you put in, say, $1,000 or $1,000,000, you get 30% of that investment right back in the form of a tax credit from the federal government. So that explains why so much solar is being built now, because the investment tax credit is so lucrative.
To me, when I look at this, I'm seeing a level of, I don't expect institutions to be perfect. I don't expect either the government or the market to be perfect. But what I am seeing is a level of recklessness and institutional decadence. And I mean that not in a like the typical knee-jerk pejorative sense, but really a falling away from what we have considered to be a tradition of governance in America.
And I think
And
that fecklessness,
yeah,
irresponsibility,
and
irresponsibility. Yeah.
I mean, I don't even understand how to hold anybody to account for this. I mean, and it's clear that they want to weasel out of it, right? Because in ERCOT, in your state, they just lost their bid for legal immunity.
Yeah. And this is a big issue.
It's a huge issue.
The sovereign immunity question is one that, okay, so I've written in Forbes, and I may overstated what the potential losses are just because of the mispricing in the market, right? So depending on whose numbers you believe, the way the market was structured, and because of the way the regulators acted, there could have been overcharges of something like $26 billion. That was what I put in my most recent Forbes piece. Well, maybe it's half that, or maybe a little less. So, okay, that's 10 billion. But you're already seeing, like, Rayburn Country Electric Cooperative has securitized already $900 million of the debt that they're owed to ERCOT. Okay, so that's going to be tacked onto ratepayer bills. Brazos Electric Cooperative, one of the oldest and biggest in the state of Texas, they are in bankruptcy court claiming that ERCOT, they shouldn't be responsible to pay ERCOT $1.9 billion. So there's nearly $3 billion right there that may have to be securitized. But then there's the other part of this, which is ERCOT as an RTO. And what is it? Is it a state entity?
Yeah.
Well, the Dallas Court of Appeals just recently said, no, it's not a state entity, and it doesn't deserve sovereign immunity. So that means all these personal injury lawsuits and all the property and casualty lawsuits, where there are 131 insurers who have sued ERCOT now, that potentially ERCOT could be on the hook for these legal judgments or insurance judgments against them as an RTO. Well, ERCOT doesn't have any money. They're just a clearinghouse. So if they are held responsible and they don't have sovereign immunity, there's yet another hit the ratepayers are going to take on top of the securitization of the past debts and the higher cost of gas and all these other inflationary aspects that are already coming down the ratepayer pike, that are going to just slam consumers because of a badly designed market that is not able to control these federal subsidies that are distorting the market.
I mean, it's just a mess, right? Like, I'm trying to figure out what the vision for energy is in America, and I don't see one basically anywhere I look. And I mean, I can only find it as depressing. It feels like, for all of its faults, in the era of the investor-owned utility, that was also an era of incredible manufacturing power in America. There was a basic sense of the importance of energy. I'll give you an example. My mother grew up in Detroit. Part of her 8th grade science unit was the internal combustion engine.
Wow.
Right? So just the basics of how that worked, because you'd have kids that were going to leave and go to trade school.
Right. And then into the factories.
And then they could work their way up into management or whatever. They didn't have to have a degree. And that was a sort of back pocket walking around sense that existed. And I think we're very far from that right now.
And getting further.
Yeah, and getting further. So as somebody who's been in the game of communicating these issues to the public for a really long time, like, what do you think our duty is as people who want to represent these ideas correctly? And what do you think is the most effective way to do that?
Well, I think the challenge, and it's one that I still work at, but you have to know your numbers and you have to know your units. And therein lies one of the key challenges, is that our science curricula in our schools is just not designed, it doesn't teach energy well. It just doesn't. It doesn't even teach the most basic things in terms of energy and power. They're not the same things. Energy is the ability to do work. Power is the rate at which work gets done. We only use energy to convert it into power, whether it's lighting power, amplification power, or cooking power, motive power. We use power in different ways, but to get power, we have to make energy flow. Well, these are basic concepts, but for people to really be energy literate, They need to understand how to convert the imperial units to joules, the horsepower into watts, all these things that are basic facts, because that's part of the key here is that who are the policymakers? Who are the lawmakers? Well, they're all lawyers. Well, why are they lawyers? Because they couldn't do the math to get into engineering school. I mean, that's just the truth. So they get, they hear some carpetbagger, some climate change carpetbagger saying, oh, well, we got to save the climate. Well, we need this, that, and the other. And the lawyers say, oh, yeah, well, that sounds good to me. Oh, I'm going to do that. Well, what about, but it's also, so it's a level of scientific incompetence among the policymakers. But it's something else I've been thinking about quite a lot, Emmett, and I think this might rhyme with how you're seeing it as well, is that it's a failure to understand the grid as a complex network. And it was a guy named Martin Minchev at Howard Payne University here in Brownwood, Texas. He and I were corresponding, and that was his point to me. And I thought, all due credit to him, because he made me think about that in a different way, that there's a lack of understanding of the grid as our most complex, biggest, and most important energy network. And unless you understand it as a network that has to be all, or as Meredith Angwin rightly says, calls it an orchestra, that it has to work together all the time, and and by gradually undermining it with all of this asynchronous generation, weather-dependent renewables, it's all been done with no kind of understanding or appreciation of the complexity and the importance of the system as a system. And I think that I don't think I'm getting esoteric here. I'm just trying to put my finger right on what is the fundamental misunderstanding that we're dealing with. And I think that that's one of them.
I think that's true too. I think there's an epistemic problem. And I think that it exists with a really difficult political problem that no one quite knows how to solve. And that's the problem of the green NGO. And not just that, the NGO in general has now become a way to circumvent what should be the basic political operations of America's Republican democracy.
Keep going on that, because I like where you're going with that, because I see very similar thing, that they have the media, the money, and the momentum, and there's no check on their power. And
right.
The more the oligarchs that's are giving them more money.
Right. So that's part of it. So if we want to take a look at any democratic system is going to be informational in its bedrock, because cases have to be made. This is a problem as old as Athenian democracy, the first we know of. Who has access to the commanding heights of that information and how it gets disseminated has also always been a problem since then. One of the difficulties with the NGO space is that it operates in a way that is so opaque that we're not really sure what the relationships are between these big money groups that fund political campaigns, that do organizing efforts, that do all of this work that civil society organizations that were membership societies used to do in the earlier part of the 20th century, which were thicker communal ties to the community. Instead, these are membership organizations that take money from donors. So their relationship to the media and the media class is, I think, very much obscured from public view, and creates this level of epistemic dissonance, especially when it comes to issues like energy in the public sphere. So that means that the realm in which we're having our conversations about what we think we know about energy is so distorted and inaccurate that we're confusing a bad map for what is precious terrain.
You stated it very well. I'll add one thing, which is that I've thought about this quite a lot as well lately. And, just trying to stack up the comparison of the dollars, right? Because the go-to strategy, and I've seen this myself and I've seen it used against me, so I'm very familiar with it, is, oh, well, that guy, he's just working for the fossil fuel business, can't trust anything. When in reality, the NGOs, the anti-hydrocarbon, anti-nuclear crowd, has outspends the fossil fuel business and the hydrocarbon business by factors of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, it's not even close. But here's the part so that's a quick aside. But what's the fundamental difference? between the producers, the ones that have to produce molecules and electrons. Well,
Hmm.
that's a that's a hard business because you've got to have a network of a system of systems and people that know what they're doing, engineers, people that know how to handle a wrench, drive a truck, all these other things to deliver electrons and molecules to the consumer so the economy and that we can keep the energy flowing and the economy can be powered. But what about these NGOs? They don't have to produce a goddamn thing. All
Yep.
they have to do is to justify the campaign. All they have to do is tell the donor, see, our campaign was successful. So they're not producing, they don't have to make anything work. All they have to do is justify their own existence. So it's a kind of asymmetric warfare that we're fighting against. And I consider myself fighting against this misinformation that's being promulgated by these NGOs who are, as you point out, unaccountable, uninformed, and they don't have to produce anything. And so it's undermining the very fabric of our most important networks, and it's extraordinarily dangerous, and it's incredibly bad for the poor and the middle class because they, among all of them, have no voice in any of this.
Hmm. Hmm. And I'd like to stack.
Does that rhyme? Does that make
No,
sense
I
to
think
you?
that's right, and I think we should add another way in which this has changed. I think about this in terms of the type of, let's say, if we wanted to be very highfalutin, the discursive environment is brought about by different technology. In other words, what technology does to media and our relationship to ourselves, each other, and the information we receive. If we look at the post-war era, if we just look at the beginning of modernism or modernity, not modernity, that goes back way farther, but sort of the end of the 19th century to let's say about the 1960s, or 70s, I'll say. That is largely, as I understand it, the era of the transistor. And
Yeah,
so it's a lot about amplifying, right? So we can think of Elvis here, right? Playing
yeah.
through an
Rock, rock,
amplifier,
rock
right?
and
Rock and
rock and
roll, right?
rock and
Broadcasting all of this, sending a
the
big signal out to a
the
lot of people.
the
And
Fender
this,
amplifier. Yeah,
right, exactly. And this jives with all sorts of other technology of the era, like the megaphone, a lot of the art that happens around there that's interested in mass psychology and how these things happen. And then around the 70s, when Silicon Valley starts to mature and to become civilianized, we enter, I think, the era of the semiconductor. And that is a different discursive environment because it starts to become incredibly digital. And the digital social sphere is now it's a dominant part of our lives that we don't understand very well because its changes are less obvious than that of the era of the transistor, which could be seen as an exaggeration of the social life that preceded it. This is, I think, a deeper alteration. What do I mean by that? When we're on social media, when we're doing all of these things, as those of us in the typing and emailing class do, there's a funny thing that happens when we're dealing with these avatars of ourselves and they start to bleed into our everyday lives. And now, who we are in this digital social sphere becomes a very disconnected social experience that ends up being more meaningful than we think it is. In other words, when we look at climate activism, when we look at all of these things that these big money groups dump into, what they are doing is helping contour and form people's identities around specific causes, which is a deeper problem than old school political faction problems, which everyone who's ever lived in a political community has had to deal with. That's part of why I think so many problems, which are technical and might have political constituencies, energy would be one of them, are now cultural problems that have to do with the alleged moral worth of different people in our society, which is why people can get away with saying Robert Bryce is just a shell for fossil fuels. You don't have to pay attention to any of the information he's saying because that is how the signaling of the self and the community works in the age of the semiconductor.
because the tribe. You don't. I thought about this because Obama talked at the Glasgow conference, right, in
Mm-hmm.
COP26, and there was no numbers in his presentation, right? It was all about, oh, you're being activists around climate. That's really good. Just be an activist. Which, well, okay, but well, what's the outcome? What are you actually trying to do?
Hmm.
And that the identification, the self-identification and tribalism around, well, I'm a climate activist, I'm a climate hawk, and that just by that self-branding that's enough. And what I've really tried to do in my work is, okay, well, okay, yes, climate is a concern, but it's not our only concern. And
Hmm.
if this is our concern, what are we going to do? It's not enough to just say, I hate Exxon or I hate Chevron or well, you name it. Well, what are you going to do? How are you going to keep the economy working? That's the question. And it's one that they don't have to answer because these groups, these NGOs, they only have to justify their campaign. They don't have to
Hmm.
actually make any of the trains run on time.
Hmm.
And so that accentuates this, this factionalism. But you use that word discursive environment. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that just means like the realm in which we hash these things out, right? So I said it's sort of self-consciously like a highfalutin way to say that. You
yeah,
know, we get to call it the public sphere, but we also can't really call it that anymore because it's not public, right? Like
right,
Facebook isn't public. I mean,
right,
what you do there is like in public, but it's
yeah,
not public in the sense of res publica, public things,
yeah,
right? That we look at. And I use the term environment because it happens across media
right,
and in many different platforms. So you
right.
can't just say in the press because it's unclear what that really means now.
And in an age of Substack, what is that anymore?
Exactly,
And that
exactly.
there's this atomization of the media now that I see as both good and quite dangerous. And I think about it a lot myself because I'm on Twitter, and I think, well, I don't have a blue check. And I've tried to get the blue check now 4 times. And they've said, no, you can't have the blue check. And
Yeah,
I'm
you
like,
can't get your
I
respectability card.
hate your fucking blue check. And I hate that I fucking want the blue check. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
But this is the little self gratification that I like, oh, I got someone retweeted my thing. But I've also had to step back and think, well, no, my work is important just because it's my work and because I'm trying to
Mhm.
bring a humanist approach to the issues of energy and power, and that I will stake myself and my reputation on that thing every day of the week, 900 times a month, because this matters so much.
Mhm.
And yet there is so little attention to it. In it's such a casual kind of, oh, well, we're just going to change over all of our systems to solar and wind. Well, oh, okay, right. Well, where are you going to get your neodymium? Oh, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, right.
Instead, it's just like, well, oh, it's okay that you're going to outsource all of our supply chains to China, and that you're okay. How much slave labor is it okay for you to have in your solar panels? I mean, is it just 5%? I mean, is it 1%? I mean,
Mhm.
how much slave labor is okay for you? And
Yeah.
I and I do a lot of public speaking, and I put that out in front of audiences, and I say it that plain, and
Mhm.
yet that's glossed over. It's like, oh yeah, the State Department sanctions imports of polysilicon from Uyghur-controlled Xinjiang, or the Uyghur slave labor in Xinjiang. It was a news story for 2 days, and it's not mentioned again. Well, I'm
No,
mentioning it as often as I can.
no. Well, I would say this too, right? There was that, it was a long road that was supposed to connect with the copper mines in Alaska.
Right.
And as you and I both know, copper is an essential part for both wind turbines, especially wind turbines and solar panels
And EVs.
and EVs. And now that whole process, which was approved under the Trump administration, is getting the good old NRC treatment of being arbitrarily rescinded.
Right.
So then the question that I think geopolitically is, how dependent do you want America to be?
Yeah.
It would be
And
one thing if they were saying, we're going to expand our mining operations to make America self sufficient in its production of these resources. I still think it wouldn't be worth it because I don't think that just in a dollars and cents way, wind and solar add up. But I could respect that position as a coherent national industrial strategy.
right. And there is no national industrial policy. There's no sense of that as I mean, you look at these EV companies and you look at their supply chains and you think, well, there is really no other source of neodymium, and for neodymium iron boron magnets, which are the high strength magnets in permanent magnets used in nearly every electric vehicle. And I've just done the calculations based on the numbers that Richard Harrington did at the Natural History Museum in London, and I've been presenting it in my talks. But it's to electrify half of the U.S. auto fleet. Right? So there's something like 280 million motor vehicles in America. What would you need in rough terms to electrify half of motor vehicles in the US by 2050? You'd need 2 times global copper production, 3 times global lithium, 4 times global neodymium, and 9 times global copper or global cobalt production. I mean, these are fantastical numbers, and that's global production,
Yeah.
global production, just to electrify half of the U.S. fleet. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, what is Kamala Harris in December? I'm out here with my EV. Isn't this great? I love it.
Oh,
Oh.
Pete Buttigieg was saying the same thing. Jen Psaki was asked, "Are you going to drill more?" She was like, "No, we're going to do other things." They asked Pete Buttigieg. He said, "We're going to do EV." And then people are like, "We just have to wait for light batteries. Like they're insanely dangerous and so heavy they destroy our roads right now. Roads which will only ever be made with fossil fuels, by the way.
Right.
But we'll just have to wait until we get light batteries, which is of course a fiction. That will also never happen because it's mineral, but it's going to be heavy." Like
Well,
that's just the way it works, man.
batteries stink. They still stink. I mean,
Yeah.
they're better than they were in Edison's day, but what are we still using? Lead acid by the billion of
Mm-hmm.
lead acid batteries in our starter motors in our vehicles. And this idea, again, I think it goes back to this idea that we talked about before, the system as a system. And I
Mm-hmm.
talk about the electric grid, which we can talk about as well. I know we're running out of time, but I think the electric grid we have is the electric grid we're going to have.
Yeah.
Because the idea that we're going to build all those renewables and we're going to connect them with all the high voltage transmission, the hell you are.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way to build the amount of high voltage transmission that any of these all renewable schemes demand, and yet it's just glossed over. We'll a bunch of hand waving, and we'll just put it out there, in flyover country. Well, have you been to flyover country? Because I have, and those
Yeah.
people out there don't want your bullshit.
No, they don't want your bullshit, and they want the power to turn on when they flip the switch. I mean, I've lived out there. I think that's a huge divide too. Maybe one that we'll save for later because there is a big town and country divide on
Open
what to
road.
do with land, which you and I both have a lot to say about. So we'll save it for another time because I'm always looking for an excuse to get you back on the show. And thank you for spending time with us. This was a great,
Always,
great
always,
fun.
always happy to do it, Emmett. I'm a fan, and this industrial cathedrals idea that you came up with, I steal that left and right.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, everybody, check out Robert's stuff. Remember, stay strong, stay sharp, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.